Welcome to Finance Panelen, the finance panel. This is a seminar series, or nowadays rather a webinar series, co-produced by SNS, a leading Swedish think tank, and the Swedish House of Finance at the Stockholm School of Economics. My name is Pehr Wissén, and I will moderate this seminar. And today we will discuss Wirecard and why it failed. Wirecard was earlier this year Germany's leading fintech company, included in the DAX 30, traded on the stock exchange. But after finding holes in the balance sheet, which we will shortly hear more about, Wirecard collapsed earlier this summer. In spite of having internal controls and auditors, external auditors, a management board, an external board, rating agencies, analysts, whistleblowers, media, and last but not least, regulators. Wirecard collapsed in a very dramatic chain of events, and we will ask, how could this happen in spite of all the controls? And was this an isolated event, or are there systemic failures involved in what happened to Wirecard? And we will also add a Swedish perspective and ask, could this happen in Sweden? That's too simple question, really. Of course, it could happen anywhere, but what we will try to answer is are the risks smaller or bigger in different settings, with different organizations, with different legal systems and different history and traditions? And to answer all of these questions, in 60 minutes, which is what we have gathered a fantastic group of people with lots of knowledge and wisdom in these matters. The first 10 minutes, we will listen to Katja Langenbucher, who is professor of banking and corporate law at Goethe University and the House of Finance. And she is also a co-author of a report to European Parliament on what went wrong with Wirecard and what could be done to prevent it from happening again. After Katja Langenbucher, we will have Erik Thedéen, who of course is Director General of the Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority, Finansinspektionen, but he is also a board member of the management board of the European Securities and Markets Authority, the ESMA, who issued a very well-written report on Wirecard, why it happened, how it happened, and with lots of critical comments on what happened. And after Erik, Annika Poutiainen, who is chair of the Council for Swedish Financial Reporting Supervision, Nämnden för svensk redovisningstillsyn, that supervises accounting in Sweden on a delegated mandate from Finansinspektionen and in close contact with ESMA. So Annika is very much in the middle of all we see happening. And last but not least, we have Nicolas Véron here, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute in Washington and at Bruegel in Brussels. Nicolas is one of our most frequent panelists through the years. We have had the pleasure of having him many times, and we are very proud of having him here. Nicolas has written extensively on European banking, on regulation, on accounting, and often comments on what's happening in newspapers and in panels and debates. So Nicolas is very much involved and very knowledgeable in this. And if the presenters stick to their 10 minutes, which I hope, we will have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and comments. And please use the possibility to ask questions and come with comments. So with these words, Katja Langenbucher, please, you have our full attention the next 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and to talk a little bit about Wirecard. Since I can't assume that you're all familiar with what happened in Wirecard, I have a couple of minutes prepared to quickly run over the case. And on the slide I've just shared, you will also see on the bottom part of the slide a quick overview on how financial markets oversight is structured in Germany, as this is is a somewhat specific oversight structure. So Wirecard, what happened? Wirecard was a fintech company. We've already heard that from Pehr. And they started out as providers of software for payment services. So they were pretty much an intermediary between the person paying and the person accepting the payment, trying to facilitate moving of information from the payor to the bank, from the bank to the payee. So a pretty standard service, really, which was under German supervisory law not considered to be a bank, nor was Wirecard considered to be a financial holding company. Rather, it was considered to be a pure technological company. Hence, it would not qualify under BaFin's, which is our financial supervisory authority, under BaFin's banking supervision mandate, but only under its pure, let's say, equity markets and financial reporting mandate. Now, what happened, it grew pretty quickly, too quickly, we now realized, from a small fintech company, making it eventually to a DAX company, which is the German stock index of the 30 most important German companies. Until in 2020, a financial reporting fraud was uncovered, and it was indeed 1.9 billion, so not a small sum of money, which was missing suddenly from the books and either seemed to have vanished or possibly never existed in the books of Wirecard in Asia. An interesting thing is, of course, how was it uncovered? You see on the slide up there already, largely thanks to media reports. It was indeed a couple of journalists from the Financial Times in London who had started as early as 2009 running a series of articles called The House of Wirecards. Then they kind of slowed down, and later it picked on with more force and more insights in 2018, and a lot of paper articles then in 2019, going after all types of financial fraud. Sadly, the German Supervisory Authority or anyone else in the German markets, and for that matter in the global markets, did pick up in the way Financial Times picked up. So it went on and on during 2018, 2019, and the first part of 2020, until finally the actual fraud and the extent of the fraud was uncovered. You see on the upper part of the slide, short sellers were active. They were actually the only ones, and I will run you through the actors we had in mind. They were the only ones who did contribute to uncovering the fraud. So I would like to quickly introduce you to three types of actors. One would be private actors, hybrid actors, and the third one, purely public actors. So if we're looking at private actors, who would be in a position to uncover a fraud such as that what was going on at Wirecard? Well, you would think in Germany, as we have a dual structure in our corporations, which means we have an executive board and a separate supervisory board, you would think that the supervisory board would be the first actor to turn to uncover fraud, to ask questions, to look critically at what management is doing. We didn't see any of that, unfortunately, in Wirecard, except for one female board member who had joined it and a couple of months later left the supervisory board. The next private actor you might look to would be shareholders. Obviously not the small retail shareholders who are extremely angry, deservedly so now in Germany, having lost a lot of money, but you would maybe look at institutional shareholders. Again, we saw no action on that part. None of the institutional shareholders pulled out in any way. The next private party you would have thought might be playing a role in controlling and monitoring what is going on in corporations would be bond governance actors. For example, banks handing out credit. There were a number of banks which had handed out credit to Wirecard. Again, nothing happened from the side of those banks. Apparently, as far as we know, obviously, nobody asked questions. So the only private actors we're left with is the short sellers, and I already mentioned that there was quite a bit of short selling going on, and the media. So the media in this case is indeed maybe the hero of the story, because it did go back to the FT uncovering the report. Then finally people woke up. Short sellers, as I said, there were. Unfortunately, and we might discuss that later, BaFin issued a short sale ban for about 2 months, which was criticized heavily. And only yesterday, the Bundesbank stepped forward and said it did not agree with BaFin issuing that short sale ban. Now, if we're talking about sort of hybrid actors involved in monitoring corporations, we're obviously thinking about auditors. It's Ernst & Young, which was involved in auditing Wirecard. Again, it's hard to say from the outside what precisely happened. It seems to be that there were a couple of whistles blown internally in EY, but that somebody higher up in the hierarchy must have stopped those whistles, although I stress that's only knowledge taken from papers. So I guess over time we will learn what happened and why the auditors overlooked, as we have to say today, overlooked a hole in the balance sheets in the amount of 1.9 billion. Lastly, that brings me to a public financial markets oversight. And you see on the bottom part of the slide, so there's the German Ministry of Finance, which is obviously not itself the supervisory authority, but BaFin, which is our supervisory authority, reports to the Ministry of Finance. So importantly, BaFin is not, as for example, the SEC in New York, an independent agency. It's reporting to a ministry, and in Germany, the way we think about that is that this is what the principle of democracy asks us to do. To what extent we might change that at some point would need to be found out. So BaFin does 3 types of supervision: banking supervision, capital market supervision, and financial reporting supervision. Now, Wirecard is playing in the latter realm, financial reporting. And here there's a germ specificity, namely that there is a private self-regulatory body involved called FREP, Financial Reporting Enforcement Panel. And now the way the German law is structured, at least for now, and our parliament is a process of changing that, but as for now, BaFin is only competent to investigate under 2 conditions. Firstly, FREP has established that the issuer does either not cooperate or it disputes the findings. Or if this doesn't happen, secondly, BaFin has serious doubts about the quality of FREP's investigations. Now, in Wirecard, none of these 2 exceptions to the general rule held. So it was FREP, which had been investigating on a really small budget with only 1 person going through the books and through the numbers of Wirecard. This dragged on for more than a year, which in hindsight might explain, or at least contribute to explaining, why it took so long for BaFin to finally figure out what was going wrong. And then, of course, in a couple of weeks, the whole thing tumbled down and Wirecard now is insolvent. What is left over from Wirecard is its bank. So the bank subsidiary itself was in good standing. That bank subsidiary is, of course, supervised by the other arm of BaFin, which does the banking supervision. But the main problem with the main company, the parent company, led to insolvency. So I've exhausted my 10 minutes, and I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you very much, Katja. Very good, and kept time perfectly. Erik, Thedéen.
Okay, thanks. Technical issues is kind of making you more frightened than to speak to this distinguished audience. So thank you for a very interesting presentation, Katja. And of course, you have this in-depth knowledge about what happened on ground, let's say, in Germany. What I know a little bit on ground is that I am in the ESMA board, as was announced by Pehr. So ESMA, we did what we call a fast track peer review, which is basically that we do a peer review that we do a little bit quicker than normal. And by November the 2nd, we issued a report about the basically if there was any wrongdoing, let's say, in the German system regarding the Wirecard case. And we did find some things that we pinpointed, and I'll go through them very kind of from an oversight perspective, and then we can go into details. One issue that was brought to knowledge to all of us, and I think was alluded a little bit of by Katja as well, was the independence of BaFin. So there was one thing that the employees there was no information about their shareholdings, which is of course a very natural thing for most regulators to have, but de facto you couldn't be sure that the part of the staff could actually be holding, in the extreme case, even Wirecard. And then when it comes to the political influence, I think what was really apparent, and this is what I understand also talking to Katja in advance here, there was a very, very close link between BaFin and the Ministry of Finance, even in close relations to various cases. So it's very clear for me looking into that report and talking to people familiar to the German system that this is very, very different to the Swedish system. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Although I think it's also fair to say that all authorities that I talk to, other FSAs around the world, they have links to the government. So we are not independent in the sense that central banks are, and they have a very special case as they basically are independent when it comes to monetary policy. So I think Katja mentioned the SEC. Well, they are more independent in the sense of the day-to-day business, but it's also true that the commission of SEC is elected on political basis. So basically now it's 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. Following the election, it's probably going to be 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So also in the SEC case, there is definitely a link to the political, or if you like, the democratic part of government. There was also what we found was that the monitoring by FREP and BaFin on what's going on when it comes to Wirecard. I think what was pointed out in the report that there were several signs, including media whistleblowers, that this is a company that one should look into. And ESMA's report finds that they didn't do that in a timely way, neither FREP or BaFin. And also specifically for FREP, they didn't scope the investigation following the media coverage. And I think generally you could say also that the overall system, this two-tier system in the German version, you could have some questions around. FREP is then, they work under the delegation from the Ministry of Justice, whereas BaFin works under the Ministry of Finance. So basically, there is no direct legal link between BaFin and FREP. And if you compare that to the Swedish system, basically the council, which Annika will talk more about, they act under the delegation of us, of the Swedish Finansinspektionen. So there is no kind of link to any other part of governments, the Ministry of Justice. So it's only a direct link from government to us to the council. So in that sense, I think that's a very big difference. Another thing that we pointed out was that there was a strong confidentiality regime between various parts within the system, but definitely also between FREP and BaFin. So that was kind of hindering the flow of information. It could actually, more anecdotal, I think, also be mentioned that FREP and BaFin sits in different cities. So although now we're used to video conferences, but of course that I think is an indication that maybe the interaction, the cooperation was not a tight one. So let me say a few words then about the Swedish system. So we also have a, let's say, two-tier system. We had that until 2019, that was a two-tier system that basically the self-regulation was done by the two exchanges. But in 2019, this was changed following a new law, and it's now under this new council under the kind of umbrella of the major self-regulatory body in Sweden. I was heavily involved personally, actually, in kind of discussing that setup. I think what we worked hard with was to get the right balance, the strong link between us and the council, and also to have the independence of the personnel under Annika that actually do the work, that they are independent vis-a-vis the issuers. So there is a lot of writings in the kind of statutes safeguarding that. I think that's an important point. And maybe more important, which I also then mentioned now, is the very, very strong link between us and the council. So basically, we talk and meet on a bi-weekly basis. Also, when it comes to cases, we could take over cases. And so it's not this kind of hurdle that Katja was mentioning that need to be met, but basically we could take over when we feel it's appropriate to take over. We could also instruct the council to go in a certain direction. So it's, in that sense, it's both our two-tier system, they are very, in a way, very, very different. So why did it, I will leave the word to next speaker, but why did this happen? I think it's a combination of many things, but I think it was a very, very good discussion that Katja brought up. Nobody asked questions, and of course, the board, the shareholders, but I think accountants, you need to discuss the role of the accountants here. They can't always, of course, find out fraud, but given the amount of media attention, whistleblowers, is to me striking that the accountants didn't do more. But of course, also the whole regulatory system, which I discussed, which was one of the things that we came up with in this ESMA report. I should, as a last thing, also say that although the supervision is national, so Germany has its supervision, we have ours. This is actually one of the areas where you have the closest cooperation between different authorities. So we actually discuss de facto specific cases and principles in the community under the umbrella of ESMA. So I think there is a fairly close cooperation, but so I think that's important to say, because there will, of course, be discussion, two discussions: should we have a two-tier system? Should we have more centralized supervision? Sometimes neither of those, answers are easy to, or questions are easy to answer, but maybe the answer is that you should, try to improve the system you have rather than to change the system completely. But I guess that's a discussion that we will have. So I think I'll stop there, Pehr, and leave the word open for next speaker.
Thank you very much, Erik. And you set the stage for Annika to continue your comments. So please, Annika.
Thank you. Thank you, Pehr. Thank you, Katja, and thank you, Erik. And thank you for having me here. I have a supervisory point of view on this. I've been a supervisor all my life, actually, and now, as you heard, I'm the chair of the Council for Swedish Financial Reporting Supervision. And we have, as Erik said, a similar setup to the German one, but it's not the same, as you also heard. We have had this mandate since January 2019, and we have worked with the Swedish FSA closely to get this to work as good as possible. And we are very close, as actually Erik said, when we got this mandate, we are the extended arm of the Swedish FSA in this. So we work closely on the cases, and the FSA can always in parallel investigate, and the FSA is the one who then also sanctions cases. But I would say a difference to the German system is that what I've understood from FREP is that they were legal constraints both in regarding the scope, what they were allowed to ask from the company's information and so forth. So they said that their hands were tied to some point. I don't feel that we have the same in Sweden. We can ask whichever questions we want, and then the Swedish FSA has more, of course, authority than to investigate. And we have the same goal with the Swedish FSA, is to promote trust in the markets. And as Katja, she really did explain very well the all the checks and balances there were, but it's quite amazing that there were so many checks and balances, and this was going on as a listed company. So there was Frankfurt Stock Exchange, there was BaFin. Actually, Wirecard also had an e-money license from the UK FSA. There were the banks also, and it got an investment grade from Moody's, and also so there were a lot of national and international balances. But I would say the weak link here, in my view, and I have of course read the reporting in the media. So I don't have the whole picture, of course, but I would say that there was peculiarities in the acting of BaFin, in my view, regarding the short selling ban and the criminal complaint filed by BaFin against the journalist, Financial Times journalist, and so it was a failure of the checks and balances. But I would say because BaFin has such a central role, being the national competent authority in this, I think that was the weak link that the other parties did not catch this earlier. But what I would say, what this highlights, the importance, there are a few things this case highlights. It's the importance of coordination and cooperation between supervisory bodies. As Erik mentioned, the flow of information, that the exchange of information, that you're not bound by secrecy rules, that you can share information, because it is important to be quite quick on your feet when these things happen. And there were a lot of warning flags in this case, so it should have been caught much earlier. The other point, which I think it highlights, is the importance of whistleblowers, and to have really good systems in place to also safeguarding the integrity of the whistleblower, so that the information really goes to the let's say the neutral independent party that can assess the information. That's really important. And this is something actually what we will be doing here in Sweden. We will actually launch an own whistleblowing system on our website here at the council. So that's to be proactive and to catch these kind of warning signs hopefully earlier than it was done in this case. So that is really important. And failure that those were not taken care of, all the whistleblowers in this case, in a proper manner. And then accounting, I would say that was, one can really ask, because this is not the only scandal, there are other scandals as well. And I think it, is audit fit for purpose? It has been asked. What is the role of the auditor? Is it to implement and ensure compliance with accounting standards, or is it to give shareholders and other stakeholders a true and fair picture of the business of the company? And that is, I think, really important. I think the auditors needs to do a lot of soul searching here, because the audits that EY gave, they were unqualified. And you know also that EY got on the wagon in 2010. It was actually in connection with there had been allegations of accounting manipulation in 2007 regarding Wirecard, and EY was commissioned to do a special investigation, and they gave a green light to Wirecard, and then they became Wirecard's auditors after that in 2010, and it's interesting and something that should be looked at, I would say. But basically they failed basic checks, and that was really a big failure, I would say, from the accounting part, and also I really do think that you can criticize the role of the auditors in this case.
Okay, Annika, we got one question while you were talking. Are the existing controls not fitting the new developments of business models, e.g. fintech? Is that a question?
Could you repeat?
Sort of, are the controls designed for other types of business models than fintech? Is something particular with fintech that makes it necessary to rethink?
No, I would say that actually, yes, it was a fintech company, but to be honest, it was a listed company. It had licenses from different supervisory bodies. So it was under the radar, but warning signs were not picked up on. And the business model of that type of company, no, I wouldn't say that. I think, you know, the financial accounting is the same, and the checks and balances through financial accounting, they should suffice well, in my opinion.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's move on to Nicolas. Véron, are you there? The screen is yours. The next 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Pehr, and thanks for having me. It's always great to be at your seminars. I will concur with what previous speakers have said, so that will help me comply with my time discipline, despite not being Swedish. I think the first question is what has failed, and I will very much echo what Annika just said. Many things seem to have failed, but one thing that has clearly failed is financial reporting enforcement. And then there are things that appear to have failed, like audit supervision and the management of short-selling ban procedures. And then there are things that are more question marks, which have more to do with prudential regulation, for example, the regulation of the bank side of Wirecard and whether the scope of that should have been larger, and also apparently AML supervision, because it appears that there have been money laundering elements to the story. But of this, we still know relatively little. So I think when we want to assess the failure at this point, it's prudent to say, let's start with the failure of financial reporting enforcement. And that's a joint failure of BaFin and FINREP. Not FINREP, FREP, mixing my acronyms here. And to be honest, and with all due respect to the involved individuals, none of them looks good. So FREP looks entirely useless, and it's not clear to me that there is much to be rescued there. And BaFin looks like a comprehensive failure on multiple fronts, but particularly in terms of financial reporting enforcement. And I think it is a legitimate question for people who observe that from outside, why there has been so little apparent accountability at BaFin, and all the people who were involved through the chain of command to the top in the sorry sequence are still, as far as I know, in their same positions. Nobody has resigned. There has been no sanction. This is quite shocking, at least on the basis of publicly available information. So that's on the acknowledgement of failure. I'm a policy guy, so I will think of policy reform, and I will ask simple questions here. Is it possible to remedy what what we already know has failed, just with German domestic reforms. And here I will echo some things that Katja alluded to, and my answer is probably not. For a number of constitutional, cultural, and other reasons that we may come back to, the very proposition of an independent financial supervisory authority in Germany is somewhat problematic because it sits kind of uneasily in the German institutional order. And that's been confirmed by the German Constitutional Court on multiple occasions. The German notion of accountability of administrative authorities to the executive branch, and in turn accountability of the executive branch to parliament, is actually very commendable from a democratic standpoint, and that's the way it's there, because the German constitution, of course, was introduced the way it was at the time it was, but makes it problematic to have independent agencies. By the way, this is a debate in the US as well. There is a constant debate on agency power and a tug of war between Congress and independent agencies along ultimately similar lines, even so the result is very different. And I would venture the provocation that the US independent agencies are far more independent in practice, despite having political appointments at the top, as was mentioned before, than their German equivalents. So then that raises a question of if we want to fix what has failed, should there be a combination of European and German reforms? And I think the answer to that is yes. And actually that is what has been hinted at the joint paper produced for the European Parliament recently by Katja, Langenbucher and co-authors, whereas they put a lot of emphasis on European level reform, as other people have done, as a way to draw the right policy lessons from Wirecard. So that would mean beefing up or actually creating a European level of financial reporting enforcement going beyond the pure exchange of good practices and mutual information that currently takes place at ESMA, and possibly also in the separate but related field of auditor supervision. Now, there's a cautionary tale in the Wirecard story here, which is the story of the short selling ban on Wirecard, which was decided by BaFin, but under EU regulation had to be checked by ESMA. And maybe Erik, Thedéen can tell us more about it, but that was a bit of a failure of ESMA, even so I think the main failure was at BaFin, because ESMA authorized BaFin to do this short selling ban. Basically, ESMA said, yeah, we have looked at it and we agree with you. There is a case for a short selling ban, and very arguably, ESMA should not have done that. So looking at that, of course, will point to the governance of ESMA. And the governance of ESMA is majority vote by a board of supervisors in which every member state has one vote, and the chairman of ESMA, by the way, has no vote. And whether that can lead to sound supervisory decisions, I think the answer to that question has to be a firm no. So ESMA is not fit for purpose to take decisions as an effective independent supervisor, even so they do a lot of good work otherwise. By the way, I should mention here that I'm an independent board member of an entity which is supervised by ESMA, the trade repository arm of DTCC, but I'm not speaking in this capacity today, so this has nothing to do with what I'm saying. So essentially, that's a big agenda, because what I'm saying is that at the European level, what is needed is a reform of the mandate of ESMA so that it would have more authority over financial reporting enforcement, and I think also audit supervision, but also a reform of the governance and possibly the funding of ESMA so that they would be fit for purpose as an independent, effective supervisor. I think all this is urgent, very necessary, connects with the broader agenda of capital markets union, but we've seen in the last few years that there was a lot of resistance against that simple agenda. In the German context, obviously, I know less about Germany than I know about the European level, but I'm trying to look at it, and my impression is that the least hopeless way, the more promising way to enhance the effective independence of German supervisory agencies is precisely to embed them in a European network, where the impulse, also in terms of culture and good practices, comes from the European level. And this is exactly what is happening right now in banking supervision through the single supervisory mechanism, which has been in place for 6 years. And I think many people would agree with the proposition that this has led to an improvement of BaFin supervisory practices in the area of banking prudential supervision. So then the question becomes, what about market supervision, financial reporting, enforcement, and all that? I think, as I said, FREP has been proven as completely useless and actually harmful. This is not necessarily a criticism of all two-tier systems, and I'm not expressing a judgment on the Swedish one, which, as Erik told us, is very different from the German one. So I'm not making any statement on Sweden here. But I think in terms of the German situation, there is no case that I can see for a two-tier system. So my advice to German reformers is just terminate FREP. There's nothing to be rescued there. Then the question becomes, should BaFin remain what it is, which is a sprawling supervisor that covers prudential and market supervision, or should it be broken up, whether along different lines in 2 or 3 organizations in charge of prudential supervision of banks, in the SSM, market supervision, including financial reporting enforcement, and other functions. I personally believe that if you accept this view that effective supervision in Germany will come through being embedded in a European network, such breakup would make sense because it would create more specific cultures around market supervision and prudential supervision, respectively, in dedicated organizations. But that's debatable. It's also debatable whether if BaFin loses prudential supervision and becomes a market supervision, whether the rest should be done by the Bundesbank or another bodies. There are legal issues involved. I'm coming close to my 10 minutes, so I'll stop there. Again, very many thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. At this stage of a seminar, I typically ask everybody up on stage. So could we have everybody up on the screen? Does any of you want to comment on what we have heard from?
Actually, I have one comment to Nicolas. Not one comment, just an observation, actually. In our supervision of the financial reporting, we follow very closely the guidelines of ESMA for enforcement of financial reporting. And basically, it is checking the financial reports against the accounting standards. That's what we do. So it's not forensic what we do. So that's sort of a systemic thing that is what we check, that they are in compliance with with IFRS or US GAAP, as it can be as well. So that's good to be aware of.
Thank you.
I could comment on some of the things that was mentioned by Nicolas. I think, well, on the short selling, let's put it like this: that on a philosophical point of view and from a policy point of view, I'm totally on your side. We took a big fight now during the pandemic crisis. We're still in a pandemic crisis, but the crisis this spring, where there was proposal to have a European short selling ban, which was that actually didn't happen, partly because that we voted against it. Here, I think we need a more thorough policy discussion in Europe, and hopefully Nicolas could contribute to that, and also within ESMA. I tried, but it seems that in some countries this is seen out to be a very, very important tool. Which is very, very kind of hard to understand, given that I think the research tells us that this is something that typically should be a normal and even I would argue a good thing in markets, because you could express both positive and negative views through your positioning in the market. But this is not. If I take that argument with some of my peers in ESMA, especially some Southern European countries, it's very, very hard for them to understand. When it comes to the how to organize, this is an ongoing discussion that I think me and Nicolas have previously as well, and it's an ongoing discussion I have with my peers around the globe. I think sometimes Nicolas and some other commentators are very, very quick. And, if you have one, let's say crisis accident, it's directly you need to change the whole organization. And I think there's some risk with that as well. There might, if you look on a financial crisis, there were organizations that, fared pretty well, that did it okay, and others that didn't do it okay. And I think the correlation, whether they were integrated, Twin Peaks, I think it's very, very hard to find, actually. We have a special case in Europe, and that is a difficult one. I think still that it's hard to go as hard to centralization as Nicolas is thinking of, because markets are not that integrated. They are very, very different cultural things. They're also retail investors are very kind of homebound. They typically invest in their home market. So I think don't move too quick here, because that might backfire. That would be my argument. And when it comes to the independence of authorities, I think no, I agree. For sure, Germany is less independent than U.S. counterparts. But what I was trying to say is that all supervisory authorities, for that matter, other authorities, are to some extent linked to the government, and that's part of democracy. It's kind of hard to hinder, right? But how should that link look like? And I actually am a strong believer in the Swedish system, surprise. But I think it's very, very good that there is a link, but the government are forbidden to go into decision making. They can't instruct me to do anything when it comes to a decision, but they could instruct me to put my resources in a certain way, or like policy-wise, long-term, they could influence me, but they can't interfere in a Wirecard case, for example. That would be against the Constitution.
I have two questions for Katja, but I guess Nicolas will want to respond to Erik first.
Yeah, first, what I said about independent agencies, I think it's clear to everybody in Sweden that Sweden is kind of at the opposite end compared with Germany. Sweden has very independent agencies. There's been a lot of discovery of that during the COVID crisis internationally, when everybody looked at the Swedish model of independent agencies. So clearly, there's a complete difference between BaFin and the FSA from that perspective that I was referring to. On the issue of centralization, I will both agree and disagree with Erik. I agree that it would be mad to centralize everything in one go and just move from a decentralized to a centralized system on market supervision for a number of practical and also market structure reasons that he alluded to. At the same time, ESMA is now a financial supervisor, a direct financial supervisor. And as I mentioned, for disclosure purposes, I know that because I'm on the board of an entity which is directly supervised by ESMA. So for trade repositories, rating agencies, and an increasing number of market segments with legislation that will soon enter into force, there is no national supervision. ESMA is the only supervisor in the European Union for those market segments. And so if I'm correct that ESMA is not fit for purpose in terms of its governance and funding, I'm not talking about the leadership and individuals who are great, and I have nothing to say negatively about them, but in terms of the governance and funding, which is enshrined in the legislation, if ESMA is not fit for purpose as a supervisor, that's already a problem. It's not something for the future. It's something for the present. As for which segments should be centralized, I would submit that financial reporting enforcement is something that should not be subject to cultural variations. So as much as I agree with Erik that there are market segments where it's difficult to have a one-size-fits-all policy throughout the EU, I would submit that when it comes to checking that the financial statements are in line with IFRS, now I'm not even going into the forensic stuff, but I'm talking about what Annika described for us the Swedish entity as doing. I see no reason why there should be cultural variations from one member state to another. Thank you.
Thank you. Katja, I have 3 questions for you, 2 from the audience and 1 for me, and we have 10 minutes. So well, the one we have alluded to your report to Parliament more than once. I thought maybe if you could give us some idea of what your proposals is in that would be very interesting. That was my question. The second one is from Michael Wenschlag. who ask what type of reforms are being discussed / implemented in Germany due to the Wirecard scandal, if any. And the third question is from Arvid Wallgren. It's a bit longer. It says, there seems to be so many irregularities that one may get conspiracy thoughts. Have auditors and FREP's financial interest in Wirecard been scrutinized, or could private finance incentives have clouded judgments? And then also, none of you have addressed the shortcomings of the supervisory board. If I were a retail investor, I would expect them to react more to critical media reports. Then eventually it turned out to be true. Are supervisory boards in Germany fat cats in a retirement position, or is there any accountability or sanctions against poorly perfuming supervisory boards? In 7 minutes. Katja, please.
Okay. So I'll run through our recommendations from the report first. So we made 8 recommendations. Now, the first one was on whistleblowing, just like Annika said, and to encourage whistleblowing within and outside the publicly listed firms. We're also thinking about financial incentives. I'm a big fan of that, but that's been debated in our group. The next thing is short selling, which evidently, with the BaFin ban, needs to come under closer scrutiny, and it needs to be made sure that short selling is there for financial market instability as a whole, but not for individual companies. The next one was external audit strengthen accountability was our unsurprising recommendation. I mean, it does need a major overhaul. I think clarification in our laws that reasonable checks need to be there, because most auditors had said, well, this is not really part of our job, and we kind of tick the boxes and make sure that numbers are okay, but we're not there to forensically investigate, and some of this is true. And I can combine that with saying that indeed, to the other question, the German Parliament is drafting a law as we speak, and enhancing auditor liability is part of that law. Now, internal controls, and I'll combine that also with an answer to the second question, internal controls in supervisory boards. Well, our recommendation was mandate that listed firms all have effective internal control systems, especially direct access to critical information. So evidently it was a problem of information flow. And we also recommended, and this is what the German government has already been picking up, to establish dedicated audit committees. A lot of the DAX 30 firms have that anyway, but to establish it mandatorily in the law, chaired, that's what we recommended, by an independent financial expert. The German Parliament is not yet there, and a majority of independent members. So that for us seems to be really important, and that also goes to the question, are they all kind of fat cats doing nothing? So that was true, I guess, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but we did move from this situation where the supervisory board was mainly there to be there, towards a much more liability-driven system. What went wrong in Wirecard is, for today, hard to say. As I mentioned, there's one female supervisory board member I read about in the press only, who did leave right away. The others seemed to have been content. It's also true that Wirecard used to be a really small company and then grew from its roots, right? And so that also says something about who gets to sit on a supervisory board, and to what extent we might need more, even for kind of normal, unregulated industries, we might need more of a fit and proper test in the way we have it for banks. Then another of our recommendation was enforcement of financial reporting, and that goes sort of along the lines of what Nicolas and Erik said, in that we need to have one competent, accountable institution, and that needs to be BaFin. And I'm really interested in finding out more about the Swedish system, because it seems to be a really good combination, actually, kind of what the Germans had been aiming for, but it turned out to be bad legislative drafting. I doubt that it was, a manipulative thought at the beginning in the passing of the law. I think it was just badly done, because we went back to legislative history, and what they said were, we want to combine the good private system in the UK with a more public system we see in France, for example, and kind of get the best of both. we see it failed, but maybe the Swedish system is what we should have been looking to and could look now. So then the next thing combining this is give competent authority more investigative and enforcement powers, because Annika mentioned that you don't have investigative powers, and BaFin does have them in theory, but as I said on the slide, there's kind of FRAP being the first mover, and which blocked for so long the possibility for BaFin to go ahead and also go ahead with its investigative powers. This will be changed in the new law, and the new law would also give BaFin more powers. And now lastly, also going to what Nicolas said, more of a Europeanizing of the entire oversight structure, and that is debated both in Europe and also in Germany, evidently, and also in our group. I'm a big fan of that because I think a lot of it has to do with culture and Europeanizing oversight in a hub and spoke format, where we have a central Europeanized hub and different entities which are already there and contribute their knowledge and their kind of boots on the ground insight. I think that would also work in culture and would hopefully be one of the elements we need to counter what happened in Wirecard.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. I have more questions from the audience. We will not have time for them, but Katja, just a last short comment. I mean, this is not the end of the Wirecard affair. We are sort of where are we in a process? Sort of how could this play out? Are we in the middle, in the beginning,
Yeah, I guess we're really in the beginning in terms of finding out what really happened. I mean, one of the management board members fled to, we don't know where, Russia or somewhere, others said to Turkey, so he's just gone and we'll never find him. Another one is in prison, so there we will see what's going to happen to them. Then there's insolvency proceedings, which are going on and on. Some of the Wirecard group has been sold off. The bank, as I say, is still doing reasonably well. There will be a lot of lawsuits by retail investors and normal investors, obviously. So we're looking at that.
Suits against whom?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So they, some of it was connected to the still existing parts of Wirecard. They are also thinking about suing the auditors, evidently, and some of them are thinking about suing BaFin. So we have 3 entities which might be sued. Yeah, I guess that's for now. And then we have legislation going on.
Thank you very much. That was interesting. Lots of both case-specific issues, but also systemic questions that are well worth probably more seminars in years to come. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.